With that overview, let's talk about the Pay Transparency Law, SB 1162, to start out. So this law expands employee rights to pay information. And prior to January 1st of 2023, there was a law in effect that said employers had to provide pay scales to applicants, people who are applying for a job, only after they requested it and only after they interviewed with that employer for that job. So there was some requirement on pay transparency that was already in effect, but as you could see, it's pretty limited. And the legislature, and also, by the way, large employers had to provide EEO-1 reports. So again, employers that had more than 100 employees had to file a federal report, it's called an EEO-1, that set forth data about the race and ethnicity and gender of their employees and some data on their pay. So there was some pay transparency requirements already in place, but the California legislature said, you know what, we really want to make sure that employers are protecting the equal pay rights of employees. We want to make sure that people are not being paid unfairly or unequally based on things like gender and race and ethnicity, and therefore we are going to pass some additional rules that require this pay transparency. So the first and most important change that SB 1162 put into effect is that employers that have more than 15 employees now have to put pay information on their job postings. So if you do not have 15 employees, and that's 15 W-2 employees, and that would count both part-time and full-time, by the way. If you don't have more than 15, this doesn't apply to you. However, if you do have more than 15, you must include the, quote, pay scale on any job posting. So if you're putting it out on Indeed or Glassdoor or one of the online platforms, if you're posting it internally, if you're advertising for a position in any way, you need to include that pay scale somewhere on the job posting. If you use a third party for recruiting purposes, you outsource your recruiting to someone else, and they are the entity that is putting that posting online on Indeed or whatever, you have to make sure that that third party is also putting the pay scale on the posting. You as the employer are liable to make sure that the third party is doing what they are supposed to do. Now, what does pay scale mean? This is one of the $24,000 questions, or $24 million questions, I'm not sure what it is now, that is left kind of open by this law. Pay scale is defined under the law as what an employer would reasonably expect to pay for the position. So what does that mean? My interpretation is it is not based on what the scale is for the employees that you currently have in that position, because you may have outliers or unicorns. Well, let me just give you one example. You may have a situation where you've got somebody in a job classification, widget maker, and they previously worked in a lead or supervisory position, and for whatever reason, they went back down to widget maker. And because you're a nice employer, and nice employers always finish last in California, by the way, but because you're a nice employer, you decided to keep their pay scale at what they were making as a supervisor or a lead. But it's out of whack with the other widget makers that you have employed. So my interpretation is you would not reasonably expect to pay a widget maker that you were hiring, even if they were experienced, at that higher rate that is based on different duties, supervisory duties. So one of the big questions that came out of this law is, do I have to post the wage scale based on what I am actually paying people? And my answer is, that's not what the law says. It says you must put the pay scale on what you would reasonably expect to pay for that position, not for a new hire, but just in general for people who regularly have those duties. Second requirement, And this requirement applies to all employers, not just employers with 15 or more employees. If an applicant requests the pay scale, you must provide it to them. So the law previously said you had to provide it to them after an interview. Now it doesn't matter whether they are interviewing or they're just walking in the door and asking for an application for employment. If they request to know what the pay scale is, you have to provide it to them. And of course, the law doesn't specify whether or not it is in writing or verbally. Probably best practice is do something in writing so you can demonstrate that you actually provided it to them. Now, you don't have to provide it for all positions. If someone comes in and says, I'm applying to be the widget maker, but I want to know what your president makes, you don't have to supply it to them, only for the position that they are applying for. And this also applies to employees. So if you have an employee who comes in and says, I want to know what the president makes, you don't have to provide it to them. But if they come in and say, I want to know what the pay scale is for my position, you have to provide it to them. And again, the number of employees that you have is irrelevant. So just to recap, if you've got more than 15 employees, then you have to put the pay scale on the posting. If you have less than 15 employees, you don't necessarily have to put it on the posting, but if an applicant or an employee requests it, you must provide it to them.